The young man from Santa Fe had a notebook and the particular expression of someone who has traveled a long way to hear stories he believes he already understands. He set his coffee cup on the edge of my workbench, not on the cloth I'd laid out for that purpose, but on the raw wood beside it where the ring would stay. And he asked me which structure I was most proud of in 40 years of building in Colfax County. I told him the truth. The most impressive piece of practical engineering I encountered in 4 decades of work in New Mexico Territory was a structure I did not build. I had almost no hand in it. What hand I did have, I offered late, after I had already told the woman building it that her central idea was unlikely to work. She listened to my objection, addressed it, and proceeded. The system she built that autumn functioned without interruption for at least 33 years that I am personally aware of, and possibly longer. Her name was Marta Vasquez, and she was 34 years old in the autumn of 1878. And she was a widow, and she built the thing herself, largely alone, in the evenings after the day's other work was finished. The young man wrote this down and looked up and waited for me to continue. I poured us both more coffee and tried to think about where to begin, with Marta herself, or with the valley, or with the winter that was coming, which none of us in Mora Valley fully understood until it was already sitting on our chests. I decided to begin with water, because without understanding what water meant out there, in that territory, at that elevation, in that decade, nothing that followed would make proper sense. You have to understand what Mora Valley looked like before you can understand what it asked of the people who tried to live in it. It sits at nearly 7,000 feet above sea level in the mountains of northern New Mexico Territory, which means it is colder than it looks, and drier than it feels, and more unforgiving than either of those things suggests. The light in autumn has a quality I have never seen replicated anywhere else, thin and precise, the way light behaves at altitude, cutting shadows that are sharp enough to read the time by. In that light, the landscape looks generous. Wide meadows, adequate grass, the Cimarron River running clean out of the mountains to the west. A person riding through in September could be forgiven for thinking it would be easy. It was not easy. The winters at that elevation were capable of dropping to temperatures that had no reasonable business visiting the surface of the earth. The ground froze hard enough to turn a spade blade. The air became a substance rather than an absence. You moved through it with effort, and it pushed back. Water was the foundation of everything, not a convenience, the foundation. A hand-dug well in that country represented 6 months of labor in good soil, longer in the clay and rock that characterized the western sections of the valley. The men who dug them did it with short-handled tools in a narrowing shaft, hauling the spoil up in buckets, shoring the walls as they went. Some wells took a full season to reach water. Some never did. The ones that did were treated with the respect you give to something that keeps you alive. In summer and early autumn, the wells functioned reliably. The water table in the valley was adequate, and a household well of 15 or 18 feet would pull water without complaint. The problems began in winter. In a normal winter, which is to say, a winter that was merely hard rather than catastrophic, the surface of a well would freeze over, and a morning's work with a hatchet would open it again. The rope and bucket mechanism would ice up periodically, and you'd spend time you didn't have thawing it before the animals went without water too long. In a severe winter, a well of 15 or 18 feet could freeze down through the entire accessible column. Not just the surface. The water itself, locked in ice from the casing down to a depth that a bucket on a rope couldn't reach past anyway. When that happened, a family melted snow. Snow melt from clean accumulation could sustain people for a time, if they were willing to do nothing else all day but feed a fire and watch a pot. It could not sustain cattle, not adequately. Cattle that went without sufficient water in extreme cold declined faster than cattle that went without feed, because the cold itself accelerated the dehydration, and because stressed animals in cold conditions burned through their body reserves in ways that became irreversible before you understood what you were watching. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was not a normal winter. By September, the old men in Cimarron were saying something was wrong with the season. The elk had come down from the high country 3 weeks before their usual time. The coyotes were moving south in numbers that suggested they knew something. The light that I mentioned, that thin, precise autumn light, had a quality that the men who'd been in the territory longest described as too clear, too hard-edged. A sky that clear in September, at that elevation, meant the moisture had already left the air, and what was coming was not a wet winter that would be merely brutal. It was a dry, cold winter, the kind of cold that has no insulation in it, the kind that sits down and stays. Most people in the valley spent that autumn stacking firewood and reinforcing barn walls and laying in supplies. They prepared for a hard winter the way they had prepared for every hard winter before it. One person spent that autumn digging a trench. Marta Vasquez had been a widow for 18 months when the autumn of 1878 arrived. Her husband Daniel had died in July of 1877, a Thursday, from typhoid fever that progressed with a speed that left no time for preparation or acceptance or any of the things people like to believe death allows. He had seemed unremarkable at breakfast. By the following Monday he was in the ground, and Tomas, who was 13 then, had helped dig part of the grave himself because the men who came to assist arrived after dark and the work needed to be done before morning. Daniel Vasquez had been a blacksmith from Missouri who came to New Mexico Territory by way of Kansas and arrived in Cimarron in 1869 with tools, competence, and enough stubbornness to make a go of 80 acres of homestead land on the valley's western edge. He was Anglo, Marta was not. Their marriage was the subject of varying opinion in the community. Opinions that were mostly kept to an indoor volume because Daniel was well regarded and physically substantial, and not the kind of man who invited the outdoor expression of opinions about his household. After he died, the opinions did not become louder exactly, but they became less careful about being quiet. I first saw Marta about 6 months after Daniel's death. I was passing her property on the road to a timber job north of town and stopped to water my horse at the trough near her fence line. She was repairing a fence post in the far corner of the near pasture, not replacing it, which would have been the straightforward approach, but driving a secondary stake at a sharp angle into the ground 2 feet from the primary, lashing the two together with a wrapping technique I had not seen before. The repaired post was, when I tested it later with my own hand at her invitation, more stable than a new post would have been in that rocky soil. I asked her where she had learned that. She said her father. I asked who her father was. She said he was a man named Felipe Reyes, who had spent 30 years building and repairing acequia systems across northern New Mexico Territory, the old irrigation channels that the Spanish had constructed in the previous centuries and that the Pueblo people before them had understood in principles that went back further than Spanish memory. Felipe had worked for landowners and later for American surveyors, and later for anyone who needed water, moved from one place to another across difficult ground. He had died in 1874 of a lung condition contracted over years of work in excavation dust, without ever owning the land he spent his life moving water across. Marta had grown up on his job sites, not as an apprentice. Felipe had no formal relationship with her education. She was simply present from the time she was old enough to carry a water bucket, watching problems get identified and addressed, and, sometimes, watching them fail to get addressed and observing what that failure cost. She did not learn from him in the way a student learns from a teacher. She absorbed his understanding the way ground absorbs heat, slowly, at depth, in a form that persists after the source is gone. By the autumn of 1878, she had been managing 80 acres alone for a year and a half. The homestead was functional. She had 8 cattle, a kitchen garden that had produced adequately, a root cellar with vegetables sufficient for a normal winter, firewood for a normal winter, and 2 children, Tomas at 14 and Rosa at 9, who worked with the focused efficiency of children who understood, without being told directly, that the margin between adequate and not adequate was not wide. She was not a dramatic person. She was not a person who announced herself or her intentions or her reasoning to the surrounding community as a matter of course. She did her work, and she observed the world around her with the careful, continuous attention that her father had modeled across 30 years of solving problems in terrain that didn't accommodate carelessness. What she had observed, by September of 1878, was that the winter coming was not the winter the valley was preparing for. The first person to hear about what Marta was planning was Clara Hoffman, who farmed 120 acres on the valley's northern edge and had been widowed herself the previous spring when her husband Wilhelm died of a burst appendix 3 days from the nearest doctor. Clara told me about the conversation later in the careful way she had of describing things she wasn't sure she fully understood yet. Marta had stopped by in late September, ostensibly to return a borrowed pot, and stayed for coffee and mentioned, in the tone of someone raising a practical question rather than proposing a scheme, that she was thinking about the wells. Clara said she was thinking about them too. Everyone was. Marta said she was thinking about them differently. She was thinking about what happens when the freeze goes deeper than the accessible water column. She was thinking about the families in the valley whose wells were shallow, and the families whose cattle would be the first to show the effects of inadequate water in sustained cold, and the families who would be melting snow by February and calling it adequate because they had no other word for it. Clara asked what Marta intended to do about it. Marta said she was going to put the water underground, not in the well. The well was already underground. She was going to move a portion of the water from the well to a point beneath her cabin floor, through a pipe buried deep enough that it stayed below the frost. She was going to keep a reservoir there, at ground temperature, accessible through the floor. She was going to, in her father's phrase, go under the winter instead of through it. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know enough about it to tell you whether it will work, but I know I haven't heard anyone else in this valley say anything like it." She meant this, I think, as a form of encouragement. It was also, accurately, a description of the problem Marta was about to encounter. She had an idea that no one around her had considered, which meant that no one around her had any framework for evaluating it, which meant that the default response was doubt. Not malicious doubt, not dismissive doubt, but the cautious, self-protective doubt of people who had learned, at some expense, that the frontier had a long memory for optimism. The word reached Samuel Adcock within a week, as words in small communities do, carried by the ordinary traffic of people stopping at the trading post and the feed store and each other's fence lines in the course of the day's business. Samuel had 240 acres, the largest Anglo-held property in the immediate area, and 6 years of Mora Valley winters behind him, and the particular authority of a man who had rebuilt his cattle herd from nothing after losing it to disease in 1875. He did not suffer what he considered foolishness easily, partly because he had paid for his own foolishness once and did not intend to again. He came to Marta's property on an October morning and found her in the near pasture, checking the fence line where the posts ran close to the dry creek bed. He asked her directly what she was planning to do with her well. She told him directly. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and listened to the whole explanation without interrupting, which I later came to understand was his version of respect for a person he wasn't sure he agreed with. When she finished, he said, "You're going to put a clay pipe in the ground and trust it to stay whole through a winter you can't predict, in soil you can't monitor once it's covered, carrying water you can't access any other way if the pipe fails." Marta said that was roughly accurate. He said, "I've seen clay work perfectly for 2 seasons and shatter in the third. Freeze gets into a joint and the expansion cracks it. You won't know it's cracked until the reservoir's empty and your cattle have been short on water for 3 days. By then the pipe's frozen into the ground and you can't reach it." Marta said she understood that risk. He said, "Do you have a solution to it?" She said she was working on one. Samuel looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man filing information away for later reference rather than forming an immediate judgment. Then he said, "I hope you find it. I genuinely do. But I want you to understand that if this fails in January, there's no fixing it in January. There's only surviving what comes after." He rode back toward his own land, and Marta watched him go, and then she went back to checking the fence posts, moving methodically along the line, testing each one with both hands before moving to the next. She had heard him. She had understood his objection completely. It was, as objections go, technically sound. It was also, as she explained to me much later, beside the point. The question Samuel was asking was whether the pipe would hold. The question she was asking was what happened if she built nothing. She already knew the answer to the second question. The first question had an answer that could only be found one way. She needed to find a solution to the joint problem, and she needed to find it before the ground froze, and she needed to dig 40 feet of trench in the evenings after the cattle were fed and the children were settled and the day's irreducible work was done. She went back to the fence line and kept checking posts until the light gave out. The discovery, as Marta described it to me years afterward, did not feel like a discovery at all. It felt like remembering. This is a distinction she was particular about. She did not want credit for an insight, she said, because what happened in that trench in early October was not insight. It was recognition. The particular sensation of encountering something you have always known and simply not had occasion to need yet. She had carried the knowledge for 20 years without knowing she was carrying it, the way you carry the memory of a smell or the sound of a specific voice, dormant and weightless until the moment a door opens and it is simply there, fully formed, requiring nothing from you except the willingness to use it. I asked her once how she knew the difference between genuine recognition and the story a person tells themselves afterward to make a fortunate guess seem like inevitable wisdom. She thought about that for a while. Then she said, "Because when I put my hand against that soil, I wasn't guessing. I was remembering my father's voice, and he was not a man who guessed." She had been digging a foundation trench for a small storage structure on the eastern side of the cabin. Nothing ambitious, a shed for tools and the overflow from the root cellar, a project she had been postponing since spring and could not postpone past October without losing the ground to frost. Tomas had helped her lay out the dimensions with stakes and twine the previous afternoon. The work itself she was doing alone in the early morning before the day's other demands accumulated. The soil in that part of her property was layered in the way that much of the valley's western edge was layered. A few inches of loose topsoil, dark and workable, giving way to a band of clay-shot gravel, then to the dense red clay that lay beneath most of the valley floor like a second ground hiding inside the first. The clay was hard work. It required the full weight of a spade driven straight down before it would yield, and it came up in chunks rather than in the loose, accommodating crumbles of decent topsoil. She had been at it for 2 hours, and the trench was 18 inches deep. She was kneeling to clear the spoil from the trench floor when she noticed it. She had her left hand pressed flat against the wall of the trench to steady herself in the cramped space, and the clay beneath her palm was warm. Not warm in any dramatic sense, not warm the way a stone is warm after a day in direct sun, warm in the specific steady way that living things are warm. A warmth that came from depth rather than from surface, that was entirely indifferent to the fact that the air above the trench had a bite in it by 8 in the morning now, and that the grass beyond the spoil pile had been showing frost at dawn for a week. She stayed still for a moment. Then she pressed her other palm against the opposite wall. Same temperature. She looked up at the rectangle of sky above the trench, pale and thin with early October light, and she listened to herself think. Her father's voice came to her not as a memory with shape and location, not as a scene she could place on a specific day or job site. It came the way knowledge comes when it has been absorbed rather than taught, as a fact that simply existed inside her with his cadence on it. The earth remembers summer. Surface forgets. Go deep enough and it hasn't forgotten yet. He had not said this to her as a lesson. He had said it probably to another man on a job site. One of the explanations he offered when a crew member questioned why an acequia repair required excavating to a specific depth rather than a shallower one that would have been easier. Marta had been nearby, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, carrying something or watching something, part of the landscape of the job site, the way children become part of landscapes when they spend enough time in them. She had heard it and filed it in the place where you file things that seem important but not immediately applicable. 20 years later, on her knees in a trench on the western edge of Mora Valley, with the cold coming and the well sitting, shallow and insufficient in the far corner of the property, she understood what she had been waiting to apply it to. She knelt in the trench for several minutes without moving, which Tomas noticed from the garden, where he was clearing the last of the season's squash vines, and came over to ask if something was wrong. She told him nothing was wrong. She told him she needed to think. He went back to the squash vines, and she stayed in the trench with her palms against the warm clay, working through the idea in the methodical, unhurried way her father had modeled across 30 years of solving problems that did not accommodate impatience. That evening, after supper, she cleared the table and drew on the floorboards with a stick of charcoal. This was how she thought through spatial problems, not on paper, which was scarce and felt too permanent for ideas still being tested, but on whatever flat surface was available. The floor of the cabin was smooth pine boards, darkened by 2 years of use, and it had served as her drafting table before. Tomas and Rosa sat on the bench against the wall and watched. The drawing was simple. A line representing the well casing, 40 feet of straight run to a box representing a point beneath the cabin floor with a slight downward angle from the well toward the box. Beside the box, she drew a rectangle representing the reservoir, with a dotted line above it indicating the floorboard and a circle indicating where the draw point would be. She explained it as she drew it, not as a presentation, but as thinking out loud, which was the way Felipe had always worked through problems in front of her, as if the explanation and the reasoning were the same act. Tomas listened with the focused attention of someone taking in information he intends to evaluate rather than merely receive. He was 14, and he had been doing a man's work for 18 months, and this had given him an adult's habit of weighing what he heard before responding to it. He asked the first question that mattered. What happens if the pipe angle is wrong? Marta said she wasn't sure what he meant. He said, if the slope isn't steep enough, the water doesn't move. It sits in the pipe. And sitting water in a clay pipe in winter is the same problem you started with, just underground instead of above it. She looked at her drawing. He was right. The slope was not a detail. The slope was the mechanism. Without sufficient angle to ensure that water moved continuously through the pipe by gravity rather than pooling at low points, the entire system was a clay vessel full of water at frost depth, which was closer to adequate than an unprotected well, but not what she was designing. She sat with this for a while. Rosa, who was 9 and had been quiet through the conversation, got up and went to the shelf where she kept the small collection of things she used for her own purposes: a stub of pencil, the back pages of a used-up almanac, a piece of flat shale she liked the color of. She came back with the almanac and sat beside Marta on the floor and began to draw her own version of her mother's diagram, smaller, less precise, but recognizable. She drew the well as a circle with lines going down into it, the pipe as a careful series of short dashes, the reservoir as a square with a lid. Marta watched her daughter draw for a moment, then looked back at her own diagram. The slope needed to be calculated, not estimated. She needed to know the exact elevation difference between the well casing and the point beneath the cabin floor. And she needed to know whether that difference, across 40 feet, was sufficient to move water reliably, or whether she needed to engineer more drop into the line, which would mean digging deeper at the cabin end, which would mean more work and a reservoir lower in the ground than she'd planned. She measured the following morning. The well sat on ground approximately 11 inches higher than the soil directly beneath the cabin floor, a natural consequence of the gentle grade that ran from the slightly elevated pasture toward the drainage on the cabin's south side. Across 40 feet, 11 inches of drop was a slope of just over 2%. Her father had used a minimum of 3% on acequia sections that needed to move water reliably against the resistance of earthen channels. It wasn't enough. She needed 8 more inches of drop, which meant the reservoir end of the pipe needed to be 8 inches deeper than she'd drawn it. Not a catastrophic revision, but a revision that cost her 2 additional days of digging at the cabin end and changed the depth of the reservoir from 16 inches below floor level to 24 inches, which had implications for the floorboard access mechanism and the height of the draw point above the reservoir floor. She redrew the diagram that evening, with Tomas checking the arithmetic on the slope calculation twice, while Rosa added the new dimensions to her own drawing in careful pencil marks along the edges. This was, Marta told me, the moment she understood the project was real. Not the moment of discovery in the trench, which had the quality of vision. Not the first drawing on the floor, which had the quality of intention. The moment she sat down with a revised diagram and a slope calculation she'd been wrong about the first time and worked through the correction without drama, that was the moment it became engineering rather than idea. She began digging the trench the following week. The work proceeded in the late afternoons, after the cattle were fed and the kitchen garden tasks finished, and the children settled with their evening lessons. She dug in 2-hour shifts, working from the well end toward the cabin, moving the spoil to a low section of the drainage swale downslope, where it would compact over winter and reduce the pooling that happened in wet springs. Tomas hauled the spoil buckets. He did not complain about this. He did, on the third afternoon, say that the work would go faster if he dug and she hauled, since he was taller and the trench would suit his reach better. She considered this for a moment and told him he was right, and they switched. The soil was familiar from the storage shed foundation work, topsoil giving way quickly to the dense red clay, which came out in flat-sided chunks that stacked cleanly in the bucket. Clay soil has a smell when it is freshly cut, mineral and faintly damp, the smell of compressed thyme. In cold air, the smell sharpened. By the second week of October, the mornings were cold enough that the surface clay had a brittleness to it that disappeared a few inches down, where the ground was still working on the memory of summer. By the end of the first week, they had completed 14 feet of trench. It was at this point that I arrived. I want to be accurate about my role in what follows, because I have told this story enough times to know that the temptation in any retelling is to improve your own position. I was not a mentor to Marta Vasquez. I was not a partner in the design. I was a carpenter who heard a rumor at the feed store about a widow on the western edge of the valley who was digging a 40-foot trench toward her own cabin and who was professionally unable to let that information sit unexamined. I told my wife I was passing by on the way to check some timber that I was not, in fact, going to check that afternoon. I rode out to the Vasquez property and found Marta in the trench, not supervising, in the trench, working a short-handled spade in the measured rhythm of someone who has found the pace they can sustain without injury, and Tomas hauling spoil in a handcart toward the drainage swale, and Rosa sitting on an upturned bucket near the cabin wall with an almanac on her knees and a pencil in her hand. I tied my horse and walked over to the trench and looked in. The excavation was clean. The walls were vertical and smooth, which told me she had been working carefully rather than quickly. The depth was right at 22 inches, which she was maintaining with a marked stick she used to check each section before moving to the next. The slope was visible to the eye, a slight but consistent angle running downhill toward the cabin. I asked her what she was building. She told me. I listened to the full explanation, which she delivered from inside the trench without stopping work. Not from rudeness, but from the practical understanding that the light was going, and the explanation did not require her to stop. She described the pipe, the insulation wrap, the reservoir, the slope calculation, and the access mechanism. She described the depth rationale in terms that suggested she understood the ground temperature principle, not just the empirical observation. When she finished, I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "The slope is right. The depth is right. The insulation wrap is the approach I've seen used on old acequia sections, and it holds." She waited. I said, "My concern is the pipe joints." She looked up at me then from the trench with the expression of someone who has been waiting for the objection that matters. I had seen clay pipe fail in ways that had nothing to do with the pipe itself. Sound material, proper firing, correct installation, functioning for 2 winters without complaint. Then a 3rd winter brought a hard enough freeze, and the water in the pipe at the joint, where 2 sections met and where the seal was thinner than the pipe wall, took on enough ice crystal expansion to split the clay along the seam. From the outside there was no sign. The pipe looked unchanged. The evidence was the reservoir that stopped filling. By the time you understood what had happened, the pipe was frozen into the ground, and the freeze had 3 more weeks on it. I told her this. She listened without the expression of a person absorbing a blow. She listened the way her father had listened to difficult soil reports, I imagined, as information, nothing more. Then she asked me 2 questions, one after the other, with a pause between them for thinking rather than for response. The first, is the joint failure a function of the clay composition or the joint geometry? I said geometry primarily. The joint is thinner than the pipe wall, which means less thermal mass to slow the freeze. The second, is there a material with more dimensional stability under freeze expansion that could line the interior of the pipe at the joint points? I thought about this for longer than I expected to. Cedar, I said finally. Old-growth cedar, split and fitted to the interior curve. Dimensionally stable, water-resistant, and it would reinforce the joint from inside without interfering with the water flow. I had never seen it done in a pipe application. I had seen it used in a different context, lining the interior corners of timber frame structures in high-moisture environments, and the principle was the same. She nodded once, slowly, in the manner of a person integrating a new variable into a calculation already in progress. How much cedar would that require? I gave her a rough figure. She did the arithmetic in her head in the time it took me to pick up my hat from where I'd set it on the spoil pile. She said, "I can get that from the salvage pile at Reinhold's sawmill. He owes Daniel a debt from before he died, and I haven't collected it yet." I had no response to that. She went back to digging. I stood at the edge of the trench for a while longer, watching her work the spade in the red clay in the thinning afternoon light. The trench was clean and true, the slope consistent, the walls standing without any sign of wanting to shift. Rosa was still on the upturned bucket, adding something to her drawing. Tomas was coming back with the empty cart, moving at the steady trot of a boy who has calculated exactly how many trips remain before the light fails. I rode home and told my wife I had been checking timber. She said, "How was it?" I said, "There's a woman on the western edge building something I haven't seen before." My wife, who was a more perceptive person than I gave her credit for at the time, said, "Is she going to manage it?" I thought about the trench, the slope. The cedar question she had turned around in her head in about 4 seconds. I said, "I'm starting to think she might." October in Mora Valley has a way of shortening without warning. Not the days. Those shorten predictably, a few minutes at either end, the way any calendar event proceeds. The season itself shortens. You have what feels like a reasonable amount of autumn remaining, and then you look up one morning and the quality of the air has changed in a way that is not about temperature or wind, but about something more fundamental, a kind of informing of the landscape that the accommodation period is ending, and that whatever is not finished will remain unfinished until spring, which is a long time away and not guaranteed to resemble the spring you are imagining. Marta had 14 feet of trench completed and 26 to go when the first hard weather arrived. It came on a Tuesday night in the second week of October. not as a storm, but as a simple and comprehensive dropping of temperature that left the valley floor white with frost by dawn, and the surface clay at the trench face brittled to a depth of 3 inches. Not frozen solid, not yet, but changed in texture from the workable red clay of the previous week to something that required the spade to be driven in with more force, and that came out in dry, crumbling sections rather than in the solid, cleanly cut chunks that had made the earlier work satisfying. Marta stood at the trench head that morning and pressed her thumb against the wall. The surface resisted. 4 inches down, the clay yielded normally. 8 inches down, it was unchanged from the day before. Dense, slightly damp, warm enough to leave a faint print of her thumb in it. The trench could still be dug. The window was still open. But the window had a different feel to it now. Not the generous, open-ended quality of early October, but the particular alertness of a door that someone has a hand on. She picked up the spade and went to work. The second week of construction produced the error that came closest to stopping the project entirely. It did not come from the material. It did not come from the labor. It came from a calculation, which is a more serious category of error because material failures are visible and correctable, and calculation errors live in the work invisibly until something built on top of them reveals them. Tomas found it. He had been measuring the trench depth at each section with the marked stick his mother had made for the purpose, a straight piece of pine rod with a notch cut at 22 inches and a second notch at the 24-inch depth required for the reservoir end. He was checking the 28th foot of the trench near the halfway point when he noticed that the floor of the trench was no longer running at the angle the grade stakes indicated it should be. The surface of the ground above had a consistent downhill slope toward the cabin. The floor of the trench did not match it. Somewhere in the previous 8 feet of digging, the trench bottom had flattened. Not dramatically, but measurably. The floor was running nearly level for a stretch of 6 or 7 feet before resuming its angle. He did not call out to his mother immediately. He walked the full length of the completed trench first, checking the floor at intervals with a straight piece of lath laid along the bottom and his eye sighting down it from the well end. The flat section was between the 22nd and 29th feet. Outside that section, the slope was correct. He found Marta at the spoil pile and told her what he'd found. She took the lath and walked the trench herself. She didn't speak while she did this. She checked every section he'd checked, and 2 more besides. Then she stood at the end of the trench with the lath in her hands and looked down the length of it. The flat section was not unusable. Water would move through it, sluggishly, accumulating at the low end of the flat run before the slope resumed, but moving. The question was whether sluggish movement in a 6-foot section during a hard freeze was the same as no movement. Whether water sitting in a low point for hours rather than minutes in temperatures below zero was water that would freeze in the pipe. She thought it probably was. She told Tomas she needed to re-excavate that section, not the whole stretch, just the floor of those 6 or 7 feet, deepened by 4 inches, to restore the required slope. A half-day's work if the clay cooperated, possibly a full day if it didn't. Tomas said, "I should have caught it sooner." Marta said, "You caught it before we laid pipe. That's when it needed catching." She handed him the lath and went to get the spade. I came by 2 days after the correction was made, not by plan, but because the timber job I'd been putting off was on the road past her property, and I had genuinely run out of reasons to avoid it. I found Marta at the trench face, 29 feet in, working the clay in the unhurried rhythm that I had come to associate with her approach to physical work. Not slow, but without the quality of effort that comes from pushing against a pace you can't sustain. She had been at this for 3 weeks by then. Her hands had the look of hands that had found their work. I checked the trench floor with the lath she kept on the spoil pile and found it correct throughout. I told her the cedar sections would be ready in a week. I had cut and shaped them myself in the evenings, fitting them to the interior curve of the pipe dimensions she had given me. Strips of old-growth red cedar, tight-grained and dense, fitted to lap at the joints in the manner of barrel staves, so that the expansion pressure of any ice crystal forming at a joint would be distributed across the cedar's cross-section rather than concentrated at the clay seam. She thanked me in the straightforward way she thanked people for things, which did not include unnecessary elaboration. I asked how the pipe sections were curing. She showed me the small fieldstone kiln she had built at the edge of the property, low and compact, fired with the resinous offcuts from the salvaged cedar Reinhold had provided against Daniel's debt. The clay sections she had rolled and shaped and wrapped in the grass clay composite her father had used on permanent acequia sections were stacked beside it in various stages of drying, some pale and raw, some the darker, harder color that meant the firing had gone correctly. I picked up a fired section and tapped it with my knuckle. The ring it gave was clear. Not the dull sound of underfired clay that would absorb moisture and eventually degrade, but the clean note of a piece that had achieved what potters call vitrification. Not fully, not at the temperature a fieldstone kiln could achieve, but enough. Enough for the purpose. I set it down. I said, "These will hold," Marta said. "I know." The tarpaulin incident occurred in the third week of October, and I include it not because it reflects well on anyone involved, but because it is part of the accurate account. A cold snap arrived overnight, not the hard freeze that was coming, but a precursor, the kind of cold that arrives briefly to remind you of what is being held in reserve. Marta had 33 feet of completed trench and the final section open to the weather. The open section, if it froze solid before she could complete it, would add 2 days of thaw and wait time she did not have. Samuel Adcock's hay barn was a quarter-mile away. He owned 2 large canvas tarpaulins, the kind used to cover cut timber during transport, that Marta had seen hanging inside the barn door on 2 occasions when she'd ridden past. She walked over in the early evening while Samuel was at supper and took one of the tarpaulins and laid it over the open section of trench, weighted at the edges with stones from the drainage pile. She did this with the knowledge that she was borrowing without asking, which is a thing the frontier permitted in specific circumstances and did not permit in others, and she had calculated that this circumstance was one of the former. She returned the tarpaulin the following morning with a brief note tucked under the edge of the barn door. Samuel came to her property 2 days later with the tarpaulin folded over his saddle and an expression that I would describe, having seen it myself once or twice over the years, as a man choosing words with more deliberation than usual. He said, "You could have asked." She said, "I could have. You might have said no." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I wouldn't have said no." She said, "I didn't know that then. I know it now." He left the tarpaulin. He did not say anything further, but the quality of his silence on the ride back, according to Clara Hoffman, who had seen him pass her property, was different from his usual silence, more like a man reconsidering the terms of a position he had already publicly stated. The trench was complete in the last days of October. 39 feet and 8 inches from the well, casing to the point beneath the cabin floor, running at a consistent 2.8% slope, 22 inches deep at the well end and 24 at the terminus. The floor of the trench was as clean and true as I had seen in any excavation work in the territory, done by any crew of any size with any equipment. Marta and Tomas laid the pipe in 3 long days, working from the cabin end outward so the downhill sections could support the weight of the uphill ones during setting. The cedar joint linings went in first at each connection point, fitted and tamped and sealed with a rendered clay slip that Marta made from the finest material in the spoil pile, mixed to a consistency she described as between porridge and mud, which is a precise description if you have ever worked with either. Over the wrapped pipe, the grass-clay composite insulation went down in a continuous layer, tamped firm with the back of the spade. When the trench was filled and the surface raked level, there was no visible evidence that anything had changed in that 40 feet of ground between the well and the cabin. Rosa walked the length of it twice. She was looking for something, some sign of the work underneath, and found nothing. She came back to where Marta was washing clay from her hands at the water bucket. She said, "You can't see it at all." Marta said, "That's the point." The reservoir went in last. Marta had built it in sections over the preceding weeks, a clay vessel 18 inches across and 14 inches deep, fired harder than the pipe sections because it would hold standing water continuously rather than moving water intermittently. The interior she had sealed with a rendered clay ash mixture her father had used on permanent storage cisterns, a technique old enough that she could not have told you where it had originally come from, only that it worked, and that Felipe had trusted it on structures built to last for decades. The reservoir sat in a prepared seat of compacted gravel below the cabin floor, positioned so the pipe terminus entered 4 inches above the floor of the vessel. This was deliberate. Water entering from above the floor meant that any sediment carried through the pipe settled to the bottom of the vessel rather than remaining suspended in the draw water. The draw point was a fitted clay stopper on the vessel's upper side, accessible from above when the floorboard section was lifted. Tomas built the floorboard section under Marta's direction. 2 layers of pine boards cut from the salvage cedar pile, fitted together with the grain running perpendicular so that one layer's tendency to warp counteracted the others. Between the layers, he fitted strips of wool batting cut from a blanket that had worn through at the center. The edges were sealed with rendered tallow, pressed into the joint, and smoothed flat. The finished panel weighed less than I expected when I lifted it the first time, and sealed more tightly than I expected when I set it back down. The tallow seal and the double-layer construction created a surface that gave slightly underhand pressure, but returned, the way a well-fitted door returns to its frame. Rosa had been watching the floorboard installation from the bench against the wall. When it was set in place, she got up and walked over and stood on it, testing the feel with her weight. She said, "It feels like the rest of the floor." Tomas said, "It's supposed to." She stepped off it and looked at the seam around its edges, which was tight enough that it took attention to find. She said, "If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't know." Neither Marta nor Tomas responded to this, because it was accurate and did not require response. The morning after the reservoir was installed, Marta lowered 2 buckets of water into the well and waited. 17 minutes later, she counted them. Standing at the lifted floorboard, water appeared at the pipe terminus and began to fill the reservoir. Not a rush, a steady, quiet welling, the way a spring comes up through clean gravel. The slope was working. The pipe was clear. The cedar joints were holding. She let the reservoir fill to within 3 inches of the draw point and replaced the floorboard. She stood on the sealed floor for a moment, her weight on the panel, and looked out the cabin window at the sky. The light was the hard, thin light of late October at altitude. The elk were well down from the high country. That morning, before dawn, she had heard coyotes moving south along the drainage, more of them than was usual, and closer to the cabin than they typically came at this time of year. The grass in the pasture had the particular stiff, pale quality of grass that had decided it was done for the season. November was 4 days away. She went outside to feed the cattle. The freeze came on a Sunday. There was no particular warning beyond the warnings that had been accumulating for weeks. The elk, the coyotes, the quality of the light, the thermometer's slow and patient argument. The sky on Saturday evening was clear, in the way that means the earth has nothing between itself and the cold above it. No cloud cover to hold the day's thin warmth against the ground. By Sunday morning, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, and by Sunday evening it was below 0, and the valley was quiet in the specific way that extreme cold makes things quiet, not peaceful, but held, the way a caught breath is held. Marta opened the floorboard that first morning out of procedure rather than anxiety. The reservoir had been functioning for 2 weeks by then, filling slowly by gravity through the buried pipe, maintaining a water level she checked each morning the way you check something you have built and believe in but have not yet had cause to fully trust. The water that first morning of the freeze was 49 degrees. She measured it with a small glass thermometer she kept on the shelf above the reservoir access. She wrote the number in Rosa's almanac column beside the date. She closed the floorboard and went to feed the cattle. By the third day, she could hear the difference at the well. The rope had stiffened overnight and required deliberate working to move through the pulley. By the fourth day, the bucket came up with a skim of ice on the water surface. By the sixth day, when the temperature had settled to somewhere below -20 degrees and appeared to have made a decision to stay there, the well rope was locked to the pulley with ice, and the bucket was a solid mass, and the well itself had given up producing anything accessible to a person standing above it with ordinary tools. She did not use the well during the freeze. She used the floorboard. Each morning, in the order that the morning required, she lifted the access panel, lowered the small cedar bucket she kept on the hook beside it, drew what the day needed for the household and the cattle, and closed the panel again. The water temperature varied between 46 and 51 degrees across the 11 days, tracking the slow thermal response of the earth at 22 inches to the sustained cold above it. It never approached freezing. It never gave her reason to recalculate. Clara arrived on the evening of the fifth day with her children and a sack of her own provisions, and the practical composure of a woman who had assessed her situation and made a decision without spending unnecessary time on the assessment. Her well had been solid since morning. She did not say much about it. She asked Marta how much water the reservoir was producing daily. They calculated what 2 households required, and they determined together that the margin was adequate with reasonable management. The children slept near the stove. The women worked out a water schedule on the back of Rosa's almanac and followed it without deviation for 6 days. I came on the 8th day. I will not claim my motivation was concern for Marta's welfare, because that would be imprecise. My motivation was the particular discomfort of a man who has stated a professional opinion and is no longer certain it was right, sitting in his own house listening to his cattle struggle at a frozen trough while the thermometer outside his barn read numbers he had not seen in 15 years of living in the territory. I rode out in the early morning. The cold was the kind that enters the lungs with each breath as a physical object rather than an absence of warmth, dense and present, something you accommodated rather than ignored. Marta met me at the door. She had been expecting someone to come, she told me later, though she had not known it would be me. The valley talks, even in a freeze. She showed me the reservoir without ceremony, lifted the floorboard, held the lantern over the opening so I could see the water level and the pipe terminus and the cedar-reinforced joints at the entry point. All of it intact, all of it performing exactly as drawn on the cabin floor in charcoal 6 weeks earlier. I knelt and put my hand in the water. I stayed like that for a moment. Then I stood, and I looked at her, and I said, I was wrong about the pipe. She said, you gave me the cedar. I said, after I told you the concept was unlikely to work, that is not a contribution that cancels the error. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which is one of the things I respected most about her. She did not reassure me. She said, no, but it's the contribution that mattered. We stood in her kitchen in the coldest recorded morning in Colfax County history and looked at each other across 40 feet of buried cedar-lined clay pipe that was, at that moment, doing exactly what she had designed it to do. I did not have anything else to say. I drank the coffee she poured, checked the reservoir one more time, because I am a man who checks things twice, and rode home. The freeze broke on the 11th day. The accounting, when the valley took it, was straightforward. Samuel Adcock had lost 2 cattle. The Reinhold family had spent 6 days melting snow. Their milk cow was weakened and would not recover her full production that season, and Wilhelm Reinhold had a cough that persisted into March. Several families had burned through their firewood reserves faster than expected, heating water to keep it liquid long enough to transport it to the barn. Marta's cattle were intact. Clara's children had been warm and watered for 6 days on a neighbor's floor. Rosa's almanac showed 11 days of reservoir temperature readings, none below 46 degrees, in columns as neat as anything I have seen produced by a professional surveyor. Samuel came in February alone on a Tuesday morning. He brought a young calf, healthy, well-formed, and he set the lead rope in Marta's hand without explaining the gesture, because the gesture did not require explanation. Then he asked her to walk him through the design from the beginning. She did. She drew it in the dirt of the yard with a stick, the same way she had drawn it on the cabin floor in October, taking the same time with each component, answering his questions without abbreviation. He asked the questions of a man who intended to build one himself in the spring, which is what he did. Padre Garcia organized the meeting in April at the church, framing it as a discussion of the coming irrigation season. He had asked Marta beforehand whether she would speak. She had said yes, with one condition, that she be permitted to explain where the knowledge came from. She stood at the front of the room and she spoke in English and in Spanish, moving between them without pause, and she began, before anything else, before the dimensions or the materials or the slope calculation, by describing her father. Felipe Reyes, who had spent 30 years moving water across other people's land and had died without owning any of it, who had learned from the acequia builders before him, who had learned from those before them, a chain of understanding about the way water and earth and cold relate to one another that was older than any of the structures in the valley by several centuries. "This is not my invention," she said. "I applied it to a problem my father didn't have. The understanding was his, and older than his." The room was quiet in a way that rooms are not often quiet, not politely, not impatiently, but with the quality of people who have been given something accurate and are in the process of receiving it fully. The young man from Santa Fe had stopped writing in his notebook some time earlier. He was looking at me across the workbench with the expression of someone who has received more than he came for and is still deciding what to do with it. I finished my coffee. He asked me what became of her. I told him. The homestead title in 1882, the 40 acres added in 1887. The kitchen garden she was working in when she died in 1911 at 67 on a morning in May. He asked about Tomas. I told him what I knew. That Tomas Vasquez had studied engineering in Albuquerque and had spent 30 years designing irrigation infrastructure across New Mexico and Arizona territory. Channels, diversion works, water management systems for agricultural land in semi-arid country. That he had told me once, on a visit back to Cimarron in 1903, that the engineering logic he returned to most consistently was something he had first understood at 14 years old, watching his mother measure a slope with a water level she had made from a glass tube and 2 wooden stakes. He had said, "She taught me that the land is already doing most of the work. The engineer's job is to understand what it's doing and work inside it rather than against it." I asked him where he had learned that. He said, "She learned it from her father. He learned it from the men who built the acequias." I don't know who they learned it from, but it wasn't nobody. The young man from Santa Fe wrote this down. Outside, the street in Cimarron was bright in the spring light, and the mountains to the west were still carrying snow on their upper reaches, and somewhere out on the valley's western edge, the ground was warming at the surface the way it does in April, forgetting winter the way surfaces do, while 22 inches down, it held its steady 50 degrees. The earth still carrying its summer warmth forward, indifferent to what the air above it had been doing, patient as it has always been patient, waiting for anyone paying close enough attention to make use of it.